So first, I would like to thank the organizer for inviting me to this conference. And originally, you see, the program would be like a joint paper with Thiago Berriel, but unfortunately, the paper was not ready. And I suggested Thiago to split the session with me, but he thought that I should do it by myself. So I'm presenting this paper. Fortunately, I see one of my co-authors in the audience, Marcelo Medeiros from PUC, and the other co-author is Arnildo Correia from the Central Bank of Brazil. So this apparently, by the title, doesn't appear to have any relation to business cycle, but that's not true. Let me start by telling what's the connection. That's the macro motivation for the paper. So the monetary policy effects in macroeconomics, and a lot of macro effects depend, not only monetary policy effects, depend on the extent of price rigidity, how often price change, that's one aspect. The type of friction. For example, if we have like adjustment cost, menu cost, you generate like a price rigidity of one kind, that is usually a state-dependent pricing policy. What's the state-dependent pricing policy? You change price when your deviation from your optimal price, that could be your state, hits some level. So the time of adjustment is endogenous. So this is a very appealing kind of pricing rule, but unfortunately, when you have this kind of pricing rule, as a famous paper by Golosov and Lucas show, you have very little effect. The other type of friction that you could have, generating kind of price rigidity, is information cost. When you have information cost, the pricing rules tend to be more time dependent. Since you don't have information, you cannot change when observing the state, you don't observe the state, then you have to choose at each time what's the next time of adjustment. And then you have like stronger effects of monetary policy. For example, known paper about this is Monkey Race QJ paper. So that's the second aspect, the type of friction that generates price rigidity. The third aspect is the price complementarity, how a desired price depends on the other price. And that's the aspect that we emphasize in this talk. And the idea is the following. When a price change, like since price don't change all the time simultaneously, when some price change, the other price are not changing. And when a price change and the other price are not changing, if your optimal price depends a lot of the price of your competitors, you will not change your price as much because the others are not changing their price. And that will make the effects of monetary policy stronger. So this third effect, this third aspect is strategic complementarity. You say that the strategic complementarity is stronger when your price depends a lot on the other price, in the sense that you want your price to be in the same direction as the other price. And then, nowadays, macroeconomics is not only about macro, but it's about micro too. The models are micro-founded, and you want your micro-founded model to match not only the macro facts, but also the micro facts. And then, now, people start in the last 10 years to study a lot the the individual price. For example, in the US, you have the price codes that are underlying the CPI. And also we have this kind of data in Brazil too. And then when you look at the micro evidence, you're looking at these three aspects I mentioned before, you have one of the first important papers in this recent literature, Bills and Clinton, showed that the price changed much more frequently than people believed. And with price change more frequently, that means that monetary policy effects are not strong. points in the direction. And the other thing, like that, when people try to looking at those individual price surveys and try to see what kind of rules are consistent with this, what kind of pricing rules are consistent with this macro evidence, and for sure there is evidence for some state dependency. It's very hard to know exactly what kind of rule is consistent with the macro price, but state dependency is really one important aspect that comes to mind, and also is pointed out by several recent papers. And then if you have of the three aspects I mentioned in the first slide, two go in the direction of monetary policy have not very strong effects, have low effects. And in practice, the macro studies show that monetary policy has reasonable strong effects. It works. So the third aspect that could help is to reconcile what is this micro-macro conundrum, is the degree of strategic complementarity. If price depend a lot on the other price, if price have strong strategic complementarity, and then even if the frequency of adjustments are not so low, even if you have some state dependency on price setting, we could still have reasonable macro effects. And there is a recent paper in the JP from Gartner-Leahy. They have a state-dependent policy. They calibrate the model with a strong strategic complementarity. They are able to generate like monetary policy effects. So then, what's the evidence about strategic complementarity from the micro data? The evidence before doesn't seem to be very stimulating, in the sense like, well, the investigations are usually based on model simulation. And so the evidence is a little bit indirect because depend a lot of details of the model. And they found, I'm citing here 3 papers, but for sure there are more. But they found that the evidence is not consistent with strong strategic complementarity. So then we have the complete picture of the micro-macro conundrum. What we do in this paper, we revisit the issue of the strategic complementarity in price setting, how price depends on the other price. But we use a different method from the literature. We rely on direct estimation of a strategic complementarity parameter. So I will show a little bit more what is this parameter before. But we start with, we use microdata. Use microdata from underlying the CPI of Getúlio Vargas Foundation, of this institution. And what's the, well, first I could not use US data because I didn't have access to the BLS data. But also there is some advantage of using the Brazilian data. And there is a lot of much more macro variation in the Brazilian sample. Then that could help the estimation. I will try to explain a little bit what we do with this in this picture. Let's see if I succeed. So we have this P star. What's this P star? This P star is the frictionless optimal price. What's the frictionless optimal price? It's the price that a firm would set if there were no price frictions, no information frictions, no cost of adjustment friction. In fact, we want to estimate this equation of the P star. And what is the strategic complementarity parameter? In fact, I put the wrong parameter here. I want to see how, if I press here, I want to see how this price relates to the other price. PT is the average price of the other kind. And then I want to estimate this equation. And I want to look at this parameter. In fact, the way we put it is 1 minus zeta, not zeta here, but we will see. And then I have macro variables that are here. I have macro shocks, and I have idiosyncratic shocks. I want to estimate this equation. I want to infer about this parameter. But what's the problem? Data is about price, not about frictionless price. What I observe, a price and price change. So I need a model of price rigidity to be able to say something about P star. And then we assume a state-dependent model of price rigidity. And then this is the model of price rigidity. We have this, what we call price discrepancy, the individual price in logs minus the optimal price. And then suppose you start here, and this is time, and then the optimal price is increasing, the discrepancy is decreasing, and vice versa. And then when we get to big S, that means that your price is much higher than the optimal price, and then you adjust. And then if you get to little s, that means that your price is much lower than the optimal price, and then you adjust upwards. So this is the kind of pricing rule that we are going to use to try to infer something about P star. And then how can we infer? See, this movement here is a movement on the P star. We know that when you arrive here and adjust from here to there, when you arrive here, you adjust, and then you observe, okay, there is adjustment in the sample. When there is adjustment in the sample, that means since the last adjustment I was here, this difference is related to the change in this equation. And that's what we are going to use to identify this thing. We are going to, since we have a lot of cross-section, we are able to identify the macro shocks because they hit everybody at the same time. We have the macro variables here. This is an observable variable. And you have the idiosyncratic shocks. We don't observe the idiosyncratic shock, and the idiosyncratic shock is going to give me the probability of an adjustment. And we are going to use a probit to estimate this. So, just a little bit repeating what I just said using the picture in the more formal way. The price change, when a price change, it will reflect optimal price variation, but also price adjustment. When the price changes, because your frictionless optimal price change, the P star changed, and also reflect also the frequency of price adjustment. The problem is how to disentangle those two effects. We disentangle this by postulating pricing rule. And this pricing rule takes care already of model selections. It's a model of the model selections, or of the selection effect. You know why or when a firm is adjustment is because the firm is far away from the optimum. And then adjustments are triggered whenever the price discrepancy attains a certain threshold. That's the SS rule. And then it will allow us to relate the price discrepancy to the change in the frictional optimal price since the last adjustment date, as I just argued. And then we are going to make assumptions about the non-observable idiosyncratic and about the aggregate shocks to get a relation between the probability of adjustments and the conditional mean of change in the frictionless optimal price since last adjustment given the observables. And that's the strategy. We base on these assumptions, the methodology, not only we are going to estimate the P star equation and the parameter of interest, how the P star, how the individual price relates to the other price. Also, we are going to able to recover the process of individual frictionless optimal price. That's an object of interest in macroeconomics, and that I never seen other papers being this process being estimated. Maybe I'm missing something, but. And then we are also, it's not the main objective here, but we also estimate parameters of the pricing rules that comes together with the estimation process. Yeah, one observation about our method is that the method is not based on closed model simulation. Like the other people try to infer they have like a complete model, and they simulate the model, and then they see the model is consistent with some data. So in particular, we will be basing on the supply side of the economy without closing the model, without like talking about monetary policy, without talking about the Euler equation. And then we hope that in this methodology the results should be robust with different specifications of the missing part. For example, in some other papers, if you change the monetary policy rule that's not your object, the results of your simulation change completely. And also, although we will have a kind of, we have a model, a structural model to illustrate our point, we are agnostic with respect to the specific mechanism generating strategic complementarity. Because what we are going to estimate, depending on the structural model, is a combination of parameters. What are the results? Let me tell that the parameter zeta, I put in that equation, I should have put 1 minus zeta. Range from 0.03 to 0.10. Like, if this parameter is 1, you have no strategic complementarity. The lower is the parameter, the stronger are the strategic complementarities. So we have very high degree of strategic complementarity. So we don't do any macro exercise directly, but if we plug this parameter in a complete model, for example, Gertler and Rayleigh, they have a state-dependent model with this zeta calibrated to 0.08. And then they get like important effects of monetary policy. So this suggests that what we are estimating will help to disentangle or to reconcile the micro data with the macro data. So, related literature. Talk about, especially about one paper, in fact. Biuskling and Marlin, they have 2 versions of the paper. The 2 versions have different stuff. But I think they have a similar idea for what we are trying to do. They aim at disentangle strategic complementarity from the frequency of price adjustments. And then they create the concept, they talk about the concept theoretical reset price. What's the theoretical reset price? It's the price setter would choose if she could adjust. And then, but in fact, they don't observe the theoretical reset price. And then they base their empirical exercise in another measure called empirical reset price. The empirical reset price assumes that reset price inflation from firms that are not adjusting are equal that the disinflation for firms that are adjusting. And this is not necessarily true, because when a firm adjusts, especially when we assume this SS policy, just for example, we have that you are adjusting because you are much farther away from your frictionless optimal price. And there is, in general selection, the exception is the Calvo rule, where there is no selection, where the price adjust, the firms are just drawn totally randomly, independent of the state. Under the rules that we assume, the frictionless price inflation that we are going to estimate are equal to the theoretical price reset price inflation that Bisklen and Malin defined. But they base all their conclusions on the empirical reset price inflation that will reflect movements not only in the frictionless optimal price, but these movements are blurred by this selection effect I just talked about. So, the second part of results is that we recover the frictionless optimal price, and then we compare the frictionless optimal price process with the reset price inflation, empirical reset price inflation process, and with the inflation itself. And one thing we observe is that inflation is more persistent than the frictionless inflation. I think something that one intuitively should expect. But it's much more persistent than the empirical reset price inflation that has an autocorrelation negative. I think this usually when there is selection, when you build empirical reset price inflation, you build itself together this negative autocorrelation in the process. In terms of variability, you see the reset price inflation is what I call reset price inflation, empirical reset price inflation is the P hat star. The variability of reset price inflation is much higher than the variability of inflation, and the variability of the frictionless inflation is similar to the variability of inflation. The IRF of the frictionless optimal price that we get is similar with the simulated IRF of the theoretical reset price inflation for a state-dependent model with strategic complementarity. So we don't have a closed model, but if we compare the IRF or their closed model with this, with what we estimate, is very similar. That seems that our evidence is consistent with the state-dependent model with strategic complementarity. A total closed model, too, as it should be. So the outline, I'm going to talk quickly about the model, and then a little bit more time about the empirical model and estimation, data, and results. Estou de tempo, Ricardo. Hã? Hã? 22, tá bom, tá ótimo. The model. So we have a illustrative model here, but any model that will lead to that equation that I showed would serve. Like if you don't believe exactly this model, believe another model that leads to the same P star equation, and you could use our exercise to infer about that model. So we have a kind of standard model from similar to the one in Woodford book. So, but we have like shocks. This UT is like preference shocks, like Martin Ackenbaum going to have in his paper later on. And you have this VIT is this utility of labor shock, and you're going to have also productivity shocks. And then you have like a kind of Dixie-Stiglitz constant elasticity of substitution among different varieties of consumption, and then you have you can derive the demand for individual product. That's going to be depend on the relative price, and then you have the labor supply equation, and then okay, this is also standard, and then you have a production function. In this production function, we insert here this MT. What's MT is a foreign input. We don't model the foreign economy. We just have a foreign input, and then we assume that the real exchange rate is exogenous to all this economy. That's our strategy, because we think for Brazilian data it's important to have this exchange rate channel. In this version I just presented, we have segmented labor market as in Woodford, but I will show you that you don't need that. So then, in equilibrium, we assume that exports are equal to imports to have to be able to substitute consumption by output, and then we can derive a real marginal cost function here, and then talking about the frictionless optimal price. The frictionless optimal price, if you derive this, is you have this usual markup rule. The relative desired price is markup times the marginal cost, and then we can we already had an expression for the real marginal cost in the slide before. We can substitute this in this equation, and finally, and take logs, etc., and then we get our equation, our P star equation. You see what's multiplying PT is what we are calling 1 minus zeta. And then you have PT, the price, average price, and you have nominal aggregate demand, you have real exchange rate, you have aggregate shocks, you have idiosyncratic shocks. What specifying a structural model from the beginning, it allows me to map those parameters with the more deep structural parameters. But if I had started from the different structural model that could lead to the same equation, I would just have a different mapping from the parameter to the deep structural parameters. For example, suppose I just assume that homogeneous labor markets instead of the segmented labor market hypothesis that Woodford usually likes. And then our zeta, you have this formula instead of that formula. So the mapping will be different, but the zeta is still going to be there. And what we are going to estimate is this equation. We will not worry about the relation between those parameters to the deep parameters. So, we want to estimate the frictionless optimal price, just repeating myself from the beginning. But we observe only the price change, in frequency price change. How to bridge the gap between the frictionless optimal price and the actual price. We need a model of price rigidity. We have a state model of price rigidity, the one I show in the introduction. That now will be useful to be a little bit more formal. The rule is going to be characterized by 3 parameters: the little s, the lower band, the C, the target point, and the lower and the big S, the limit of the upper band. And then we are describing the model in terms of a variable that's the price discrepancy, the price minus the optimal price. And then the adjustment rule is going to be like that. If your price discrepancy hits the lower S, you adjust by C minus S. If you are inside the range, you don't adjust. If your price discrepancy hits the upper S, and then you have a downward adjustment of S minus C. Now, the empirical model, how we develop this to bring this to the data. You have this price discrepancy again. I know that the actual price is not changing very often, so it's the same as the last time of adjustment. So this tau IT is the last time of price adjustment. But I know from my pricing rule that the last time I adjusted, my price discrepancy was C. So this price must have been C plus P star at that time. And then substituting this, I'm able to relate the price discrepancy, that's my state variable in my pricing model, to the difference between the frictionless price. And then we just rewrite the price P star equation that we had before, just in the more econometric fashion, where we have like, these are the observable macro variables, this is the macro shocks, this is idiosyncratic shocks. And we substitute this in this R star equation. And then what we get we are going to relate this equation of the price change. And then we have the difference between the observable macro variables, that is ZIT. Although those are macro variables, the subscript EI is just like indicating, because it's the difference of the variables from now since the last time of adjustment. The last time of adjustment was not the same for all units. So this has an I. And you have the difference between the aggregate shocks and the difference between the idiosyncratic shocks. So now what we have to specify is some process for the shocks. For aggregate shocks, we specify a run or walk. And for idiosyncratic shock, we have alternative specification. The one we are using here, we have like a fixed effect that will not matter for the estimation, and we're going to have the other term is going to be a run or walk with drift. Then we just substitute the process of the shocks. And then we are going to have this sum of the macro shocks. This VT is the innovation in the macro shock. That was a run or walk. You see that what are the macro shocks that matter for the unit I now, for the price discrepancy of the unit I now, are the macro shocks that happens between the last time of adjustment of this unit and now. So I have this summation. But the macro shocks are the same. They are hitting all firms at the same time. So I can write this in terms of dummies. So I'm going from the beginning of the sample until the end, and then here I have the dummies that will flash out for this unit at this time, that are when this macro shock is the dummies are related to the time since the last adjustment to now. And then here is the idiosyncratic shock. This idiosyncratic shock now already it comes from here, from this process. So it's going to be this summation, this sum of the innovation idiosyncratic shocks. So this thing is going to be normal with mean zero, and but the variance is going to depend on this delta IT, that is the time, the difference in time between now and the last time of adjustment. So this variance is going to be different for each unit, because each unit adjusts in different time. So now we define the observable variable as 1, 0, and minus 1. 1 if there is an upward adjustment, 0, no adjustment, and minus 1 is downward adjustment. And now we are going to look at the probability of upward adjustment given the observables. And here the observables will include the aggregate shocks that are going to be identified to the estimation. And this is the probability of the price discrepancy hitting the lower band, and then there is going to be an upward adjustment. When we substitute this here, the equation, we get this equation here, where variables with two dots are divided by this difference in time. That's going to be different from each unit, and you have also those parameters depending on the original parameters of the pricing rule and the standard deviation of the idiosyncratic shocks. So we are going to estimate this equation. In fact, we are going to have a set of equations. Probability of price increase is given by this equation. In similar derivation, we have the probability of keeping the same price. That's going to be the second equation. And then we have a probability of price decrease given by this other equation. So we estimate by quasi-maximum likelihood, or we see in the process we are controlling for the dependence of the cross-section due to common macro shocks, and for autocorrelation, heteroscedasticity that emerge from the structural model. And there is robust, we use robust variance-covariance matrix with correction on New West, and the asymptotics of this. Any doubt about this, you ask later about to Marcelo Medeiros, my co-author, who is an econometrician. The asymptotics is that the cross-section has to be very big compared to time. And that's what a feature of our data. And then we estimate those parameters. Now you see there, you have these betas. These betas are several betas, beta 1, beta 2. And from beta 1, beta 2, we are able to recover the zeta, that our parameter that indicates strategic complementarity, and also sigma, that's the variance of the syncratic shock, and also we are able to recover pricing rule parameters. This is the size of upward adjustment, the size of downward adjustment, and the size of the inaction range. So our data. I'm going to talk briefly about the data. There are two papers that focuses that much more detailed and focus about the paper. The data, we are not the first ones to use this data. So the paper by Solange Gouveia from the Central Bank of Brazil, and the other is a paper that I did with Barros and Matos, who work at the FGV at the EPGE, and Carlos Carvalho, who is sat there from PUC. So, but in fact, what we have like an item, a typical item is type 1 of rice from Brazil brand sold in kilos in package given outlet in Rio de Janeiro. We have price codes from each item. We use like the longest survey, that's the one based only in Rio and São Paulo. And each item is served once a month. In fact, there are items that are served more than once a month, but we use just observations once a month. And then we have a treatment. You have a treatment for sales, usually V filter, and you have like a filter by Martin Achenbauer and co-authors, not a filter. We follow them. In the recent paper, they show that price service like BLS, these price codes have some problems, and then you should exclude the products with problematic price codes, and then you get you don't have as many small adjustments, for example. And then we follow and do the same kind of treatment in our sample. And after exclusions, we are still left with 178 products and services in all 7 sectors that are representing still more than 40% of all price codes. For robustness, if you are worried about our exclusions from sales and from this kind of treatment, we do the estimation also without exclusions, and the results are very similar. So then comes our baseline estimation. You have this is the nominal aggregate demand, price, real exchange rate. You see that everything is very significant, but what interests for us is this parameter here. And you see that if this thing is close to 1, if this thing is greater than 1, we have strategic substitutability. If this thing is 1, you have no strategic complementarity. And if this thing is lower than 1, we have strategic complementarity. We see that this is very small, 0.06. The confidence interval is from 0.05 to 0.07. And then we have several robustness, like some people ask us, you have just one pricing rule for the same period. If you have, like, you should maybe change your pricing rule. Of course, we need some constancy of the pricing rule to be able to do this estimation. But if we split the sample in 2, at least for the parameter of the strategic complementarity, we still get strong strategic complementarity. In the more recent part of the sample, you get a lower strategic complementarity in the first part of the sample, but still get get both. The only big difference happens when we drop the exchange rate, and then you see that the estimations change a lot. For people who live in Brazil and follow price and macro, we believe that it is real exchange rate is a very important determinant of price, of domestic price in Brazil. So we really don't believe that we should do like that, but we took it just to see what happened. And then in this case, only in this case, we have a parameter of strategic complementarity that indicates much lower strategic complementarity. And with this parameter, and with the state-dependent model, monetary policy will not have very strong effects. And then we change the white noise process for idiosyncratic white noise. And still we get similar results. We exclude promotions, and we exclude the exclusions based on Eichenbauer et al. Recent paper, and things don't change much. And then the results of the pricing rule. First we cover also the variance of this idiosyncratic shock, and that's more or less in line with what people estimate in US. The size of adjustments, the size of upward adjustment is 6%, and the size of downward adjustments, they are really a little bit smaller compared if you do the statistics of the sample. But we are not using the size of the adjustments in the estimation. So it's not surprising that we don't go exactly in the target. We know that there is some heterogeneity in the sample. We don't treat that. And non-linearity between the relation between size and frequency, and we believe that this is the cause of getting lower adjustment size. But the asymmetry, we get the asymmetry with downward adjustment being higher than upward adjustment. This asymmetry is in Brazilian sample, it is in US sample, it is in the samples everywhere. And finally, we compare we do an exercise of comparing actual inflation, frictionless inflation, and reset price inflation. Frictionless inflation that would occur if there were nominal rigidities. They are recovered based on our P-star equation that we estimate. And in our setup with SS rules, it coincides with the theoretical reset price inflation concept in Bills, Kleno, and Malin. And we use also the measure of empirical reset price inflation between Bills, Kleno, and Malin. Because one question, especially in the first paper, they make the point that the data is not consistent in the first version of the paper. That's very different from the published one. That they do a different exercise. That they say that this is not consistent with the state-dependent model with strong strategic complementarities. They say that the US microdata is consistent with the state-dependent model with no strategic complementarity. So one question is, why are the results different? Someone could think the results are different because you are using a different sample. We are using Brazilian sample. So what we do, we calculate, we redo the exercise with our sample. So this is formally the measure of empirical reset price inflation. The price the reset price is price if there is adjustment. If there is no adjustment, you get the reset price for last period plus the inflation of price changes. When inflation price changes is calculated according to this formula. And first here is the figure where we have inflation, frictionless inflation, and reset price inflation. If you observe, reset price inflation is so different from the two other series that is even difficult to see the difference between inflation and frictionless inflation. But the statistics will show that those things are very different because this is a question of the size of the picture. You see that reset price inflation is very volatile and has a clearly for people with eyes trained to data a negative autocorrelation. That same is not true. So let's look at the data. Let's look at the statistics. The statistics that's the actual inflation from FGV price index, and we have the standard deviation and persistence. Let's start with the persistence. Actual inflation is much more persistent than frictionless inflation, which is much more persistent than reset price inflation that has this built-in negative autocorrelation. And the standard deviation, like the actual frictionless inflation, they have similar standard deviation, but the reset price inflation has a much higher standard deviation. In fact, I'm not saying here, but in the picture, but those figures that we obtain for reset price inflation Brazilian data are exactly the same, or exactly the same, never exactly the same, but very similar to what they obtain with US data. It's very volatile reset price inflation with very negative autocorrelation, and this led us then to conclude that a model is not consistent with strategic complementarity. So the difference is not the difference in the sample, the difference in methodology. And then we also do another exercise that they do. We estimate a AR6 model for all series, for P, pi star, and pi star hat. And we calculate the IRF. And we see this is actual inflation. It's no news, everybody know how it looks for actual inflation. The different variables here are the frictionless inflation, you see. The impulse response of estimated frictionless optimal price. In fact, here is you see that this shows some persistence in the frictionless optimal price, and this indicates is consistent with strategic complementarity. When we look at the same IRF for reset price, we see that this thing has not persisted. The shock dies very quickly. So, evaluating the results, the properties are similar of the reset price inflation, empirical reset price inflation, US and Brazilian data. This empirical reset price inflation is influenced by the selection effect, but not in our case, because in our case we use one model that takes care of the selection effect. There is always a question if this is the right model or not, the SS rule. Then pi star, if this model is not a bad model, would reflect more directly the strategic complementarity. Of course, our results depend on the pricing rule that we assume to be a reasonable rule. So conclusions, we have a direct estimation of price complementarity parameter based on microdata. We need to assume a pricing rule. It does not depend on demand side. We don't close the model. We have a strong strategic complementarities that we found. You see that we found this. This is consistent with the macro effects that people find when they use macro data, but we have not used any macro data in this exercise. So this could help to reconcile the difference between micro and macro. Also, our methodology recovers the frictionless optimal price. That is a fundamental variable in macroeconomics. And I remember I was very curious. I want the picture of the frictional optimal price. I never seen this object, and this is if our model, if our pricing rule is okay, is not influenced by this selection effect. Thanks.
Thanks, Marco. I think we have time for 2 questions. Marty?